are in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Continuing our study there. A little bit of a backdrop or a review. Remember, the book of 1 Corinthians, written, of course, by inspiration by the Apostle Paul to the church at Corinth, is what we might call a problem epistle. That is, that this was an epistle written to deal with problem, or really plural problems of the church there. But again, we've made this point before. But before we become too negative on the church at Corinth, which is very easy to do because there's just problem after problem after problem, I think we need to give them a little bit of credit, maybe a lot of credit, that though they had problems and had many, sometimes severe problems, that they had the right attitude about those problems. They knew they had problems. They reached out to the Apostle Paul to say, we had problems, we need help. And then, as we're going to see as we transition into 2 Corinthians, they accepted the admonition and the correction and seemed to be working on those problems. And so I think that's a wonderful commendation of this group because, as you and I know, it's the presence of problems isn't the problem. It's our unwillingness to work on those problems that is the problem. And so they're to be commended for that. And so in this section, he seems to be dealing with things that he says concerning the things which you wrote to me. That began in chapter 7. And so we looked in chapter 11, the idea of head coverings. And now the second part of chapter 11 is going to be dealing with the Lord's Supper. Now, the second part of chapter 11, dealing with the Lord's Supper, then beginning in chapters 12 and 13, he's going to be talking about the use of spiritual gifts within their assemblies. And so we have two things, chapter 11, chapter 12, and 13, that are dealing with assembly stuff, why they're gathered together as a church. And so that leads some to believe that what we discussed last Sunday, the idea of the head coverings, belongs in that category as well. He says, any woman praying or prophesying. We didn't talk a whole lot about those two things, but I want to do that before we move into this next section. What does praying and prophesying mean? Well, I think we know what it means. Praying just means bowing your head and speaking to the Father who's in heaven. Prophesying is the idea of speaking by inspiration. And so there's a debate, two debates really, among many in that section. Is this talking about the idea of a passive activity that this woman is engaged in, or an active activity? In other words, can you say of someone that you're praying and prophesying if you're just sitting in the pew quietly and you're not leading the prayer or teaching the class or preaching the sermon? And so, is that term kind of an accommodative term of praying and prophesying while that's, in other words, basically saying while that's going on, not while you're doing it as the leader, but while it's going on? That's one possibility. The other is that those terms mean maybe the most classic meaning of it, while you're the one praying, while you're the one prophesying. And we would assume, if that's the case, that that's something done outside of the assembly, that these women were praying and prophesying that was done outside the assembly. But its proximity to these other assembly activities leads some to believe that no, this is in that category of these are assembly activities. And so praying and prophesying would be kind of in the passive sense, that someone else leading the prayer, you're praying with them. Somebody else is preaching the sermon who's prophesying by inspiration, and you're just the kind of the witness of that. But anyway, just wanted to make that observation that we didn't before. All right, so now in chapter 11, verse 17, maybe in some sense the most shocking of their wrongdoings is what they did to the Lord's Supper. Uh, just we hold it in such veneration, with such respect, that it's just a shock to our system to hear these brothers and sisters in Christ abusing such a special activity. And Paul feels the same way because he says this, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 17, now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you. Now that's accordingly just simply a statement of Paul saying, I don't approve of what you're doing, but it's also a juxtaposition. Remember back up in verse 2 of this same chapter, he says, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep. So I praise you, but now I'm not praising you. Paul does this a lot, and I think this is a good example for us in correcting people. Whether you're correcting your brethren, whether you're in a position of authority, maybe at your work, and you have people under you that you might have to correct, or if you're a parent or a grandparent correcting your children, that Paul will often do this. He doesn't just lower the boom, which he does that, but he will usually before or after that kind of praise them. And I think we understand that maybe that's a good lesson in parenting. If the only time you talk to your children is when you're scolding them, then you don't have a very good relationship with your children. Same way with boss and employee. The only time you ever talk to them is when they're doing something wrong, then you're doing something wrong. And so Paul says, I praise you that you're doing this, but on this, I don't praise you. So I'm not praising you about the Lord's Supper. Since, back to verse 17, since when you come together not for the better, but for the worse. Now, I don't think Paul is saying that was intentional on their part. It was accidental. It was a result of what they were doing. It's not they were like they were conspiring and saying, let's make our worship services discouraging. But they certainly had become that. And so you're doing this not for the better. In other words, partaking of the Lord's Supper should have made you better. Better Christians, enhance your relationship to God and Jesus Christ, but it's doing just the opposite. It's not for the better, for the worse. And so, broad principle there is our worship assemblies are to be for the better. They're to be to encourage us, to build us up, and to make us better. So, first of all, Paul says, here's what I'm talking about. When you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part, I believe it. And I think we would all raise our hand and vote with Paul. We believe it too, don't we, based upon what we've seen in this letter? A lot of their problems boiled down to the core problem of division. Started off in chapter 1, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I am of Cephas. It's going to continue in chapters 12, 13, and 14 of their abuse of spiritual gifts that had divided them. And so where they were using this issue rather to unite. And so maybe, again, the point that Paul is trying to make is the Lord's Supper was one of the, maybe we could call it the byproducts of the Lord's Supper, was to unite us. That's the better, but you're using it to divide. That's the worse. Verse 19, for there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Though there's divisions, that's a bad thing, but divisions kind of serve a purpose because they kind of help us to see who's right and who's wrong in all of this, and some of you are just wrong. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. And so, one of their purposes, some would argue from this language that Paul is saying this is the primary purpose of us coming together. And some would interpret from Paul's language here that we can maybe rank the acts of worship in their importance. And Lord's Supper is number one. And our behavior sometimes speaks to that, don't we? We have people who, want to come in, take the Lord's Supper. In my lifetime, in my limited experience, we've changed the order of worship. I grew up with the Lord's Supper was after preaching. Always, wherever I went, it was after preaching. Now it has shifted to becoming before the sermon. And I can't prove this, but I think the reason it was after preaching was to trick people to stay for the preaching. Because You've seen it before, especially people maybe on vacation, about to go out of town, or got something going on. They'll come in there, partake of the Lord's Supper, and then they'll leave before the preaching. And I hope that's not just where I preach. I think that's other places too. But anyway, uh, there's that kind of that mindset that that's the most important act of worship, or maybe even the mindset that's the only one that really matters. I partake of the Lord's Supper. I've punched my card. I get credit for being there, and now I can leave and miss that kind of thing. I don't know that that's Paul's argument here. He's talking about the Lord's Supper, and so he elevates it. I'm not trying to denigrate the importance of it. I just don't know that he's saying it's more important than the others in this. But one of the purposes, at least, he's saying, is for you to partake of the Lord's Supper, and that's not really why you're coming together. Uh, this is maybe a tough question because it's one of those trying to read my mind questions. He says that you're coming together is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Well, then why were they coming together?
To fill themselves.
Yeah, to eat, to just so it had lost its spiritual purpose and its spiritual meaning. That it wasn't just, Paul seems to be conveying, it's not just some kind of physical activity that we're engaging in, it's a spiritual activity. And I would make the point that the Lord's Supper is not a meal. It's a memorial. It's never spoken of as having a purpose to fill our stomachs. It's spoken of as an attempt to remember what Christ has done for us. Larry?
Pull the string they were used to with the idol temples, where the idol meat came from, where they did have a feast. Like, oh well, we used to have a feast to Apollo, and now we're doing it for Jesus, and kind of got those two kind of merged together a little bit in their head.
Yeah, very well could have been, and we can relate to that somewhat, can't we? Although that's not an exact scenario for us, but it's difficult to leave your baggage behind. If you had certain religious background and you come in and you kind of want, well, we used to do that. Or if you have a worldly background, it's hard to give up the sinful activities. And so we all bring that baggage with us as whether we can get rid of that baggage. And so, yeah, very well could be influenced by, and you can see why. Uh, worship, worship. And so there's some correlations, and Paul would argue, no, no, it's not worship, and there's some correlations there at all. Mark?
That's why a lot of the followers would follow because they knew Jesus would feed them.
Yeah, it became about carnal things. Yeah, yeah, certainly. So Paul, yeah, so Paul's going to take them to task for two things, seemingly, in their abuse of the Lord's Supper. One is Larry's always, no, John indicated the idea of it. It would just become a meal. It's a common meal. The purpose was not to remember Jesus' death, but the purpose was to fill our stomachs. The other thing they had done, Paul's already indicated, it became a source of division rather than a source of unity. And so let's get into it. Verse 21, for in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others. One is hungry and another is drunk. So a few things as we unpack that verse. It's hard for us to relate because we live in a totally different scenario and system than they did in a couple ways. It's very different today. Number one is we don't bring our own Lord's Supper stuff. We have it. It's here. It's provided for us, and we usually have somebody who prepares it for us, and it's just there. If we ran out of the elements at the building, we'd have to go scrambling, wouldn't we? Because it's not like you brought yours with you. And so our this idea of, wait a minute, how can that happen? It seemed that in their less organized than a system that they were bringing their elements, at least somebody was bringing them in from the outside. The second thing that's different then and now, or at least there and here, is we are, generally speaking, very organized and punctual. We'll advertise our times of services, with time, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, 9:30, 10:30, and we may be a minute off here and there, but for the most part, we keep to that. don't we? That's when we start our services. In that culture, they didn't live by the calendar. They didn't live by the clock. It was just kind of. And I'm boring y'all, I know, with my stories of Sri Lanka, but that's the way it is in a lot of countries like that. That you'll ask the local preacher what time does church start, and they kind of just pause a little bit, like, well, and they'll give us a time, and we may not start till an hour after that because people aren't there yet. And so we just, again, that's just a foreign concept to us, especially to me, Mr. OCD, who was raised by my dad, whose thought was that if you're on time, you're late. He was always early for everything, and we start on time, and we do. But that's not the way they worked. And so here's the concept that some were bringing the for lack of a better way to say it, the elements of the Lord's Supper, and they were partaking of it before everybody got there. And again, it's hard for us to conceive of either one of those concepts because we don't bring it from the outside. It's here, and we have the Lord's Supper same time every time. It's just not that kind of a system. But there it was, and so they were using that of partaking, not waiting on everybody to get there. And it's we can imagine, behind all division, or let me rephrase it, almost all division, behind it is not that thing. There's usually something else. And that's true of disagreements about, different things. It's not really maybe about that thing. It's just, I don't like you. And so whatever you're for, I'm against, kind of thing. We pick sides. And so we can assume in here that this may have been some of that. It wasn't just early comers versus late comers. It may have been the wealthy versus the poor. It may have been Jew versus Gentile. It may have been just whatever. Hey, let's, whether they said it out loud or not, let's do it before they get here. We don't like them, and so we're going to exclude those. So we see that probably at work here. And so he says, what? Verse 22. Let me back up a little bit. We've talked about this in another context. He says, one is hungry and another is drunk. And we might think, wow, what kind of church service do they got people getting drunk at church? Remember, the word drunk, we use it exclusively for somebody who's inebriated, intoxicated. But the word drunk just means full. And so the idea of drunk, I don't think he's saying that they were getting drunk off the Lord's Supper wine. I think he's saying some are hungry and some are full. And so the word drunk can mean, even in the Bible, can mean the idea of you think about it, we even in our day, we have a state limit of where you've reached the blood alcohol level, that you're drunk. And so this is the idea of when you full, you're drunk. And so that seems to be the meaning of that in verse 21. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? And so the purpose of this isn't to fill your stomach. If that was the purpose, you can do that at home. Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? So maybe that lends us to this was between rich and poor, that the more wealthy ones were bringing the stuff in, and the poor were having to participate with that, and there seemed to be some disparity there. What shall I say? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. So he echoes what he had said there in verse 17 with a greater emphasis. When you ask that rhetorical kind of stinging question, we do that with our children sometimes and discipline them. Like, what were you thinking? Uh, what's going on? Those kind of questions that kind of are probing and maybe a little demeaning, but in a purposeful way. For I received from the Lord. So now he gets to the kind of the introduction of what was going on. Now he's going to say, here's what it's supposed to be. Here's where you're doing it wrong. You're not partaking of the Lord's Supper, at least not in the right way. You didn't come together for that purpose. You're abusing it. Here's the pattern. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. Now, here's this Paul's version of what we read in the gospel accounts. This was Jesus' last. We've referred to it sometimes. It seemed like somebody drew a picture about this. The Last Supper, he was partaking of the Passover with them. use that occasion and those elements and repurpose them for his Lord's Supper. And so the same night he was betrayed, he took bread. When he'd given thanks, he broke it and said, "Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In other words, again, he's just saying, here's what you're supposed to be doing. Here's what you're doing. And it's wrong, but here's what you're supposed to be doing. Here's the real purpose of this. In the same manner, verse 25, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes." So again, verses 23 through 26 is this kind of a parenthetical statement of here's what the real purpose of the Lord's Supper. Here's what you're supposed to be doing. The rest of the stuff in here is all the ways they were doing it wrong. But he was just like, here, let me remind you, here's what you're supposed to be doing. Verse 27, therefore, so since it has that gravity to it, that we are remembering this is his body. And we need to be reminded of that, don't we? We may not be abusing the Lord's Supper in a corporate way, the way they were, but we need to guard against these different abuses in our own minds, whether as a group or individually, is to be reminded that this isn't bread. It's the body of Christ. This isn't juice, it's the blood of Christ. This isn't a meal, it's a memorial. And so you can't treat it like any regular meal, any regular occurrence. And so here's the import of that. Verse 27, therefore, whoever eats this bread and drinks this cup, since it's not really a bread and not really a cup, it has higher spiritual significance. Whoever does this in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. All right, a few things about that. Anybody have the old King James? Got any old schools in here? Oh, wow, aren't we yeah. Okay. Will you read verse 27 for us in the old King James?
Shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord.
Okay. Unworthily has confused some. You were hoping for a grammar class this morning, weren't you? Unworthily, there's a difference between an adjective and an adverb. And if you can remember, I have to sing the Schoolhouse Rock songs to get it in my head. But the difference, an adjective modifies a noun. An adverb modifies a verb. Now, that's the shortened version of that. And so unworthily is an adverb. I'm trying to get it right here. This modifying an action. You're partaking. Some have read that and made unworthily an adjective. I have to pause every time to saying that we have to be worthy. That worthy is modifying me. And so I've known of brethren who on some given Sunday won't partake of the Lord's Supper because they had a rough week and they just said, I'm not worthy to partake of it. And he says, don't take of it if you're unworthy. Well, that's not what he's saying. Now, a couple things about that. We should live our lives in such a way that we don't have that conscious conflict anyway. But in reality, none of us is worthy. That was the true case, we just pass the elements and nobody would partake them. We'd have full trays every time because it just returned full, because none of us are really worthy in that sense. But that's not what he's talking about at all. He says unworthily, an adverb that modifies the action of you. You're partaking of it in a wrong way. He's not saying you're wrong, so you can't partake of it. He's saying the way you're partaking of it is wrong. And the more modern translations, like even the New King James, which isn't the most modern, says in an unworthy manner. And so that's what he's chastising them, not that they'd lived sinful lives and so they couldn't partake of it, but you're doing it wrong. Not you're wrong as a person, but you're doing it wrong. And so you're partaking of it in an unworthy manner. And if you do that, you are guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. Now, what exactly does he mean by that? Or is that an abbreviated way of saying you're guilty of not remembering the body and the blood of the Lord? Or is he saying, in a sense, you're guilty of his death? The Hebrew writer will talk about that it's possible for us to crucify him afresh. And so it's a little bit stronger language there, the idea that it's as if you killed him. We would use this expression, and I apologize, it's not a pleasant expression, but we would talk about, maybe dishonoring somebody's memory, and we would say, you're spitting on his grave. The idea, and there's that dishonor to that, and it'd be kind of the strongest way we would say if you're dishonoring someone who has passed. And so similar language there, according to a heightened level. You're not just doing that to a human being, you're doing that to the Messiah, the Son of God. But, verse 28, so that's what you're doing. If you partake of it in an improper way, you're guilty of that body and the blood. John, go ahead.
You're like trampling it underfoot.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you do that, if you treat it like it's just something to fill up on, then you're counting his blood as common.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something to be scoffed at, or
And it's
valuing.
Yeah. It's not. There's layers to this. It's not just that this was the death of an innocent man, not just the death of a martyr, but that death did something. The death that affected your salvation, you're now trampling under and dishonoring. Absolutely. So that's what you're doing. Verse 28, here's what you ought to be doing. But let a man examine himself. Again, not examine your moral life, whether you're worthy of partaking of this. Now, again, there may be a point that we need to do that, but he's saying you examine yourself in the way you're partaking. Examine yourself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. You give some thought to this. And so here's where it gets to us. We're thinking, well, this doesn't apply to us. We always do it at the same time. We've always got more than enough elements. Everybody gets to participate. We don't exclude anybody from it. But are there other ways that we can be guilty of an unworthy manner? Absolutely. One would be the most easiest one to think of is you just do it and you didn't even think about Jesus. You just partook of it, just like you were eating something. Maybe not eating a meal, but eating a light snack. You just partook of those things, and you never even remembered him. That they're certainly doing that. And so he says, examine yourself. We would say, put your thought into it. Put some thought into what you're doing here. For he who eats and drinks in that unworthy manner, verse 29, eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. And so here's, maybe in your mind at least, draw a line between this verse and verse 17. You're not doing it for the better, you're doing it for the worse. And so here's the worst part. You're actually bringing judgment on yourself. You're dishonoring the Son of God, and guess who you're going to have to stand before in judgment? And so you're bringing judgment on yourself in doing this. This is the worst part of where he says, not doing it for the better, but for the worse. And so, in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of himself. One is hungry. So the two abuses there. And now he says, here's the purpose of the Lord's Supper, and you're doing it in an unworthy manner, and in so doing, you're bringing judgment to yourself. Not, the last part of verse 29, not discerning the Lord's body. Does anybody have a word there different than discerning? Judge, not judging. The idea here is kind of the idea of making discerning, judging is making a distinction. The distinction that this isn't a common meal. This is a spiritual meal. This isn't just bread and juice. This is the body and the blood. And again, it may be even that this isn't just a man that died. This is the Son of God who died so that we might have life, not discerning the Lord's body. Now, let me pause here and make this possibility known to you. I don't think this is what he's saying, but there are some who argue that the Lord's body here is not referring to his body that he offered upon the cross that is commemorated in the bread, but that the body is the church. And that language would be accurate, but sometimes the church is referred to as the Lord's body. And so the argument is that the problem here was how it was affecting the church. And so you're not discerning, you're not giving thought to your brethren. Now, that's a good thought. I don't think I think as close as this is talking about the bread being his body, that it makes more sense that to take it in its more literal sense that this is talking about the body of Jesus, the physical body that he died on the cross that we remember. But again, I just want to give you that possibility, that option there. Verse 30 is interesting. For this reason, for what reason? Yeah, the abuse of the supper, that you're doing it in an unworthy manner. For this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. Here's the easiest question you'll get asked all day. What does he mean by sleep? Die. That's the euphemism for death. In fact, your margin, your translation may have a center column reference that makes that point. And so, for this reason, because you're not observing the Lord's Supper in the proper way, some of you are weak, some of you are sick, and some of you are even dead. Now, I think obviously he's using these terms in a spiritual sense. He's not saying that some have died physically, lost their lives, and others have some kind of disease or sickness because of their partaking of the Lord's Supper. I don't think he's talking about a food poisoning incident here, that he's talking about in a spiritual sense, that you're spiritually weak, you're spiritually sick, and some have even spiritually died. Now, what's interesting is I assume this is what Paul is doing. Let me get in my opinion box over here because I'm not sure. But that he's kind of using the comparison of physical food to this spiritual food. That if you don't eat properly, you can be weak, sick, and even die. If you just decide I'm not going to eat anymore, then you're just eventually going to get weak, sick, and die. And so, just as that can happen with a common meal, with common earthly food, it can happen on a spiritual level here, that you can get spiritually weak, spiritually sick, and even spiritually die if you're not eating enough, not doing that. Now, all right, so we get the point of what he's saying, but now let's connect those dots even on a deeper level. How is that? How can I get spiritually weak and even die spiritually from not properly discerning the Lord's body and the Lord's Supper? How does that? How do I get from one to the other? I know how I can get from one to the other about physical food. If I don't eat, I'm going to get weak, sick, or die. If I don't eat properly, I can get weak, sick, or die. I know that. I can connect those dots easily. But help me connect the dots. If I'm not properly observing the Lord's Supper, how does that line up with me being spiritually weak, sick, and dying? John?
Not taking the Lord's Supper worthily is also one who has forgotten that they were cleansed. They've forgotten that they were saved, that Jesus died for them. And so now they're at the point where they're not even remembering his death and resurrection. And so when you do that, you fall away.
Yeah, yeah.
If you start coming here, you could come here even now and be what we call a pew warmer, and just be a person who sits and goes through the motions. Well, I went to church, but you're not participating. You're not really involved. You're not engaged, and you're kind of dead spiritually because you're just a body in a pew.
Yeah.
You're not really there. And it's like when Jesus says he uses the parable of the rich, the noble person who had the feast, and all those who were invited were not worthy. So he went out and go out and to the go out and bring everyone in,
Yeah.
to the roadway, the pathways, and just invite them all in. And then there was one person who wasn't clothed properly. He said, "How did you get in here?" because that person didn't have the right garments on.
Yeah.
So he's cast out. And so in the same way, you can be here but be dead spiritually.
Yeah. And so he's in that situation where you came together, and not it goes, and that's an excellent point. And it's not that you didn't benefit from it. He doesn't say not for the better, but for neutral. When we would think, okay, that was neutral. You went to church, but you didn't get anything out of it. He's actually saying, no, that's not neutral. It's not that you just didn't get anything out of it. You actually are weaker spiritually in that regard. So not from better to worse. So yeah, excellent point. And so it teaches us that, and we talk about this all the time in our sermons and classes and all, don't we? That nothing we do in service to God, but certainly our worship activities, is not just this idea of checking a box. That, we've got, we usually say 5 acts of worship, and we got some, person that's a job is every Sunday they've got that. We give them a clipboard with check boxes. Okay, we sang, we prayed. All right, we did our job. It's not that. It's not just filling that pew. It's not just checking that box. It's to be doing something for us. Larry?
More important than the other acts of worship, I don't know that it is unique in the sense that we have to be together to do it. That you can pray on your own, you can teach around the kitchen table, you can even sing in the shower or whatever, on your own. But we're in communion. We use that term. We talk about, well, they're in communion with us. They're on the same spiritual page, and that's a unifying experience when we pass the plates and we're all partaking together. We're sitting around the table together, just like the Thanksgiving meal we're thinking about. We're all in this together. And it's supposed to be a unifying thing. And it's ironic they had turned it into something that performed the opposite. That they were dividing themselves.
Yeah. The Lord's Supper is unique in that way. It is uniquely complex as well. And I think that's his point, because in this section alone, we could make a list of, maybe the best way of saying it, what's accomplished in the Lord's Supper. And it's not just one thing. Sometimes we boil it down to that. And maybe we boil it down to at least the most important part of it, arguably, it's a remembrance of Jesus' death and suffering. But that's, Paul's telling us, no, it's more than that. It's a proclamation. You proclaim his death. And so you're pronouncing your faith, and you're pronouncing that in that. It is that communion. It's to be a unifying effect that brings us together in that observance. It is to be a spiritual growth process. That you're not just doing it, you're getting closer to Jesus, and you're getting refocused. Oh yeah, that's right. This is what it's all about. And so the complexity or the layers in this, is it remembering his death? Absolutely. But it accomplishes more than that as well. If it's done the right way. If it's done the wrong way, you're not discerning his body, you're not remembering him, you're dividing rather than uniting, and you're getting weaker rather than stronger. And so we would liken it, again, whether Paul intentionally does that or not, it's a springboard for us. We would liken it to the idea of, if you saw someone that was unhealthy, and I'm calling the pot calling the kettle black here, but somebody that's unhealthy, and you'd say, are you, maybe the doctor would say to them, are you eating properly? And they'd say, yeah, I eat 3 meals a day. Well, maybe a good doctor or a good dietitian would have a follow-up question. What are you eating? I'm eating 3 meals a day. Well, I'm eating, and you rattle off what you're eating, and the doctor says, no, there's your problem. You're eating, but you're not eating the right stuff. You're not eating, you're not eating the right way. Yeah, you're eating, but you're eating junk. Or even worse, you're eating stuff that's unhealthy. Not even unhealthy, but dangerous to you. And so just partaking of the Lord's Supper isn't enough. It's got to be in the proper way. And if it's done in the proper way, I think the argument here is if the improper partaking of the Lord's Supper makes me weak, sick, and dead, then the proper taking is going to make me strong and healthy and alive. It's going to grow us spiritually. But if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. So if you did your own discerning, then you wouldn't be judged by God for doing it wrong. But when we are judged, we're chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. So you're being judged. Paul says, I'm judging you. I'm telling you you're wrong. But the purpose of that is not just to condemn you to hell. The purpose of that is for you to fix it and make it better and do it the right way. Therefore, my brethren, when you come together, so here we've said here were the two abuses, the two problems, and now he summarizes them by fixing the two problems. When you come together to eat, wait for one another. That's simple. So and so's not here yet. Let's wait and let's make sure that they can partake with us. Again, based on their culture, the flexibility of getting together and those kind of things, somewhat unknown to us, is he just like, here's solution to problem number one. Just wait. Wait on everybody. Wait till they get there. And again, I take this, it wasn't just some accidental thing. Oh, we're sorry. We already partook of it. We didn't know you. It was maybe a little bit intentional. Hey, let's do it before they get here. So problem number one. Problem number two, verse 34, is anyone is hungry. So problem number one was you're using it as a source of division. Problem number two is you're using it as a common meal. And so problem number two is you're hungry, eat at home, lest you come together for judgment. And the rest I will set in order when I come. Then maybe there's something else they need to deal with, but he says this was the big one, and I'll deal with the other stuff when I get there. So it's it's not a common meal. It's not, purpose was not to fill our stomach, and it was to be a source of unity and growth, not division and a detriment to them spiritually. All righty, we'll pause there and pick up in chapter 12, more abuses in their worship assembly next time.